Are you in a team that runs retrospectives after every sprint? Are they fun? Or are they supposed to be fun because you've got a sailboat with an anchor and some wind, or you've got a race car with an engine and a parachute to slow it down? Or do you just have a boring list of start, stop, continue? Many teams end up in this place where they're doing retrospectives, but they're just going through the motions. They're failing to change and address the critical things. Break the cycle. Rise above. In this video, I've got 5 session formats to run retrospectives that really make a difference. And I'll end with a few general best practices on how to run them. Let's get into it. The first format is sustainable pace. I recommend to make this a what works, what doesn't format. Imagine you're physically in a room and you can put stickies on a board, or your virtual team and you have a Miro board, for example. You can just place stickies in 2 different columns, the what works column and the what doesn't work column. This is very similar to many retros that are out there already, but then it is really scoped. So every sticky you put on the board has to relate to, is it sustainable? Sustainable pace, for those who are not familiar, is defined as a pace you can maintain indefinitely. So you can ask yourself this question: what am I doing right now which I cannot maintain indefinitely? Imagine taking your exact workflow and just doing it for 6 months in a row. After those 6 months, because of what reason exactly do you really need a vacation? What is the thing that makes it not sustainable? Start to write those stickies on a board. Everybody gets a few stickies to plot down their ideas. The first column is what makes my work sustainable, or what would make my work sustainable. And the other column is what makes my work not sustainable. Some examples I can think of. Are you working overtime right now? Do you already have a hard limit on the 40-hour work week? If you don't, then that's definitely not sustainable. Are you very tired after a day of working because of lots of pair programming and mob programming? Is there already a limit on the number of hours you should do pair programming or mob programming combined? Maybe 4 or 6 hours makes sense. Do you switch your driver navigator role often enough? Are you a remote team and is communication difficult? Maybe you have low engagement because the cameras are off, the microphones are on mute, and people are side channeling a lot. Or the same 2 people are always the only ones who actually speak in meetings and in pairing and mobbing. An example schedule for running a 30-minute version of this retrospective is taking 5 minutes to write stickies. Everybody privately writes their stickies, a maximum of 3 or 4, and puts them on the board. Then you take 1 minute per person to present the stickies to each other, no discussion. You have somebody who limits the time. Then a minute to vote on the stickies. Everybody gets 3 votes. And then 15 minutes, the remaining time of your meeting, where you just discuss and try as a team to come up with 3 concrete action points. 3 things you want to change in behavior, you want to change in process, 3 things you want to do. Make it small, make it doable. You don't want to spend your whole sprint on retrospective actions, so make them really small steps. The second format is 360 feedback. And this retro needs to be introduced really carefully. It requires a safe space. It requires high psychological safety. People must not judge each other or attack each other, otherwise it's not going to work. I recommend saying a short mantra at the start of this retro. We're all here to be better versions of ourselves. We're all here because we're trying to help each other grow. We all have our blind spots, and they need to be pointed out. This is difficult for the feedback giver. They don't want to do this. This is difficult for the feedback receiver. They don't want to hear this. We're doing this because it helps us grow. The format is as follows. Everybody writes down their 3 biggest weaknesses and their 3 biggest strengths. And then you combine the results. You put it together and everybody can read all the things that were written down. And then one by one you go through the group. You read your own 3 biggest weaknesses, and then everybody can add to it. They can add other weaknesses to it. They can give you more feedback to it. They can either say they agree with one of the points and add examples, or they can add a 4th or a 5th weakness to it. And you're not allowed to respond. You're only allowed to say thank you. Not a word more. No questions, no justifications, nothing. You're really only allowed to say thank you. Multiple things can happen. You can have an emotional response. That means they're probably right. You can also have no response. Then maybe they're wrong. You have to realize it's just their perspective. It's their experience. It's a valid experience, but it isn't necessarily the truth. You want to take the feedback and see it as their perspective. You can decide for yourself what you want to do with it. And I recommend to assume the most generous interpretation of the words of the other. Now, this is not my idea. The 360 feedback exists for a while already, and I've been in multiple of these sessions in my career. But this exact format I've taken from Simon Sinek, who has a lot of content on improving people's growth mindset. This is a difficult format to run, but it will get easier with time. Remember that everybody is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be gentle with each other. This retro format takes more than 30 minutes. It's probably an hour or an hour and a half. Take your time to do it the right way. The third format is about the DORA metrics. If you're unfamiliar with them, there are 4 metrics, or there's a 5th now, and there's some other metrics around it as well, but the 4 ones are the most important ones that measure software development teams' performance. They measure both the velocity and the stability, both of the team and the software. It's worth collecting them. It's worth recording them. It's worth putting them in your sprint demo, and it's worth optimizing for them. So you might as well have a retro around them. The format of this retro could be the 2 columns with stickies. What works, what doesn't. I wouldn't do all 4 at the same time. That's probably too much scope, but you know the format by now. Take 5 minutes to write up stickies, take a minute to present the stickies to each other, take a minute to vote, then take the rest of your time to discuss and come up with 3 actions. And the output of this retro is again the 3 small actions, 3 small changes you can make as a team in the next sprint towards improving for the DORA metrics, improving your velocity, improving your throughput, and improving the stability of the software. Now, I'll quickly talk about all the 4 DORA metrics, but I don't recommend to do them all at once in one retro. Either stick with 2, combine the 2 stability ones and the 2 velocity ones, or you do it 1 per retro if you want a quick retro or if you want to take more time. If you're not measuring your DORA metrics yet, that's okay. You can still run this retro. It will still yield you value. But I do really recommend to start measuring and optimizing for DORA metrics. The first DORA metric is deployment frequency. It stands for how often you successfully release into production. You can report this as 2 numbers. The numbers of deploys per sprint, but also the number of releases to end users per sprint. For some teams, these are the same because a deploy to production is automatically a release to users. But for others, it is not. If you have feature flags, for example, you can deploy it to production, but not actually enable it and therefore not actually release to end users. A failed deploy or a quick revert doesn't count towards this metric. The first goal is to get your deploy to production to at least once per day. And the second goal is to get your release to end users at least once per day. So you can start to ask yourself these questions. How can we take smaller steps? How can we make things simpler? What prevents us from taking smaller steps? It's not about working harder. How can we work smarter? Smaller steps lead to more frequent deploys and less risk. How do we decrease the risk of our changes? How do we deploy to production but not release to end users yet? How do we release to users gradually? You can have these questions, you can literally put them on a screen somewhere while everybody writes stickies. The deployment frequency is the goal, releasing to end users more often is the goal. So how do we get there? If we scope this retro to just this one metric, just this one question, we can optimize for it. The second DORA metric is lead time for changes. It is the amount of time it takes a commit to get into production. Depending on how you define it, it is often literally the date time of the deploy minus the date time of the commit. The goal is to optimize this until it is less than an hour, because that is considered a high-performing team. You can ask yourself similar questions as you did for deployment frequency, but also questions like, do we still have manual gatekeeping in our process? Are we ready to move to trunk-based development yet? How can we speed up our build pipeline to less than 5 minutes? How can we speed up our deploy pipeline? What automated tests actually give us value? And which ones should we delete as a suite completely because it's just running but it's never failing when it's supposed to fail? The third DORA metric is change failure rate. It is the percentage of deployments causing a failure in production. You report this as a percentage of your deployments that resulted in downtime or an important feature not being available, or any deployment that required a hotfix or a rollback or a fix forward or any form of patch. Those will all count towards this number. The goal is to get the percentage of change failure rate lower than 10%. Ask yourself this question in a retro. Again, with the 2 columns, what works, what doesn't, to optimize for this number. How can we get this number lower? What is causing those failures? Where do we need more automation? What knowledge or experience are we as a team, or maybe some people in the team, missing to be effective? Where do we need mandatory pair programming or mob programming because we can't get the quality higher in another way? But be aware here that if you have a problem, just adding more tests is often not the solution because it slows down the other metrics. Your build will become slower if you add a bunch of functional or end-to-end tests that are slow. So how do you optimize for this number without throwing more tests at it? By increasing the quality, by maybe removing tests that are not adding any value and adding tests that test exactly the right thing. And the fourth and last DORA metric is time to restore service. How long does it take to recover from a failure in production? You report this metric as a length in time. How much time does it cost? How many minutes, hours, days does it cost the team to bring the service up again if it's down? Or how many time does it cost to fix the problem? The goal is to get this to less than an hour for a seriously degraded service. If you have complete downtime, you want to be up within the hour. If a feature on the side that is not that important is down, okay, maybe you don't necessarily want to have that within the hour. But you can measure all of this. You have, as a team, a responsibility to define what do we consider serious, what is core to what we build and what is not core. To optimize for this in a retrospective, ask yourself these questions. How can we improve our incident response, either in time or in behavior? What information do we need to handle these kind of problems quicker? What tools do we need to handle them? Maybe you were really quick with the software fix, but then you spent 2 days to get the database back to its previous schema. This looks different for every team. The fourth retrospective format is cost of change. For me, software quality equals cost of change. If the cost of change for a certain file, module, microservice, whatever, is very high, then the quality is low, because that's really the thing that matters. How easy can we change it? And as Kent Beck has taught us, the cost of change roughly equals the coupling that you have. If you have loads of coupling and you have a big ball of mud, you need to make a change to it. You need to unravel the big ball of mud to be able to make that change. So the cost of change, the time, the investment, the frustration, all of that is high. Therefore, the quality is low. All of this is the same. Software quality is the same as cost of change, is the same as coupling. I recommend to have a retro around this specific topic every now and then to see how you can improve specific parts of the code base that you have to prevent this big ball of mud factor, to increase the quality. This retro can take multiple forms. You can get really creative with this one. But you can also stick to the basics. What works, what doesn't, columns, put stickies in it, see where you want to improve. But I'll give 2 more interesting examples. You could, for example, take the perspective of shared code ownership. You can start identifying where shared code ownership is low, or you have no shared code at all, because you'll find that in those places, the cost of change is very high. I've talked about doing a skill mapping session before, where you have columns of people and rows of skills and software components, and you start to rate everybody on every software component and every skill. This is not to judge people and to tell people to improve. This is to see where just one person owns and touches this kind of code. And that's where you want to get away from, because that's where the risk is the highest and the cost of change is the highest. And learnings you can get from this are, okay, we need to start pairing these 2 people together on this topic. Otherwise, we will never start sharing this code base because it lies with just this person right now. But there's more insights you will gain. Another perspective is refactoring, where cost of change is high. Figuring out where you should focus your refactoring efforts. You could do a 3 Little Pigs retro, scoped on quality, or the big ball of mud factor, if you will. If you're unfamiliar with the story, all 3 build a house. One of straws, one of sticks, and one of bricks. Obviously, there's a sturdiness difference here. This could represent the level of sturdiness or quality, or cost of change you have in software. You have 3 columns, sticks, straws, sticks, bricks, and then you ask everybody to write 5 stickies. And on those stickies is a software component. Could be a function, could be a microservice, could be classes or components or whatever. And ask them to put these 5 stickies in this column. Then you start to see where the differences are, or where you completely agree. This creates a shared understanding, and it gives you the input, the insights you need to come up with a plan to start solving the problem. And the 5th session format is cross-discipline collaboration. How do you work together with other disciplines? You could just make this a what works, what doesn't, again with the 2 columns, adding stickies to that in that simple format, but really scoped on cross-discipline collaboration. Questions to answer which could get you started as a team. How can we improve our whole product focus? Does every team member understand why every feature exists? Why it's used? How it's used? What barriers are in place for us to work together between the different disciplines? Does everybody know what everybody does? Are you happy with how you collaborate with the other disciplines? Like how a dev collaborates with UX, how UX collaborates with QA? Is the quality high enough for all the different disciplines? Is the UX person happy with the current state of production, or does the UX person seem to lose all the battles from the developers who have more say in what actually happens? To make this a what works, what doesn't format, have a board, 2 columns, do the usual steps, thinking, presenting, voting, discussion, and then you end up with 3 actions to execute in the next sprint, 3 process changes maybe. So why these 5 session formats for the retrospectives? Why not the other ones? We know there's lots of games out there. Why did you pick this one? I did this because they're a well-rounded set of retros that touch on all the important aspects of team. We're trying to optimize on the DORAs to improve our throughput, our stability. We're trying to increase our software quality, the cost of change. We're trying to work on our personal skills, behavioral skills, on the feedback stuff. I think these 5 could be enough for forever, maybe for a few years, where you just rotate between them and that's all the retrospectives you have. I believe most teams don't really need those generic games. They distract from the important stuff. The games don't scope you enough, so you get into this mile-wide, inch-deep problem where it's a very shallow view of the problem. No, you need to go deep. You need to really focus into problem and zoom in to actually get to the core of the matter. And these 5 sessions actually make you do that. You touch on all the important aspects for continuous improvement. Whether it's extreme programming, Scrum, Agile, DevOps, continuous integration, continuous delivery, those are the things that matter. This is what it makes you focus on. And lastly, some tips on preparing and running retrospectives. I recommend everybody to keep a note in their note-taking system, everybody on the team, and they keep it for the 2 weeks that your sprint takes, or however long your sprint takes. And during the sprint, whenever they have an idea, whenever they see a problem, whenever they have a concern or whatever, they add to that note system. You end up with a few bullet points, and when the retro actually starts, you have prepared it because you've collected thoughts. You won't need to think back and, okay, how was the last sprint? And that takes half an hour and you'll have forgotten half the things because brains are not good at storing things. They're not hard disks. They're very good at having ideas. So once you have them, you need to store them somewhere else. And if your list is empty when the retro is today, sit down by yourself for 15 minutes. Think about the last 2 weeks. Think about what happened, what you want to change and what problems you had so that you come prepared to this meeting. It takes very little time and the meetings become so much more efficient. On running the retrospective, make sure you rotate the organizer so that it's not just one person who always has to do this. Unless you really have a Scrum Master or an Agile facilitator, sure, that person can do it. But otherwise, rotate it within the developers and the UXers and the QAers and the product owners in the team. You can really prepare the Miro board and whatever you need. There's lots of templates out there and I'll link one in the description as well. You can take the time to make sure the access rights are fine and you're not losing time while everybody's waiting on you in the meeting. And after the retro, make sure you send a message to everybody like this, the actions we've concluded, this is the owners and the deadlines so that they actually get done. And don't commit to more than 3 is my general recommendation, because I've seen many teams which commit to 10 things to improve because there's so many things to improve and then only half of them happens because it turns out it's too much work. So you have to settle on a realistic number of time you will spend after the retro on the next sprint. You take time out of the next sprint. How much is okay? You really want these things to get done, but you also want to build features and add value to users. So maybe 10% is something you can agree on. We spend a maximum of 10% of our time on the retro actions we agree to. That also forces you to make your actions small in the retro, because if you need more than 10% of your time, then you're not going to do it. I've come up with this list of formats by looking at the values of extreme programming and by looking at the DORA metrics. Just keep trying to improve on those metrics. Keep trying to improve on your behavior via the 360 feedback thing, which also increases your culture, your psychological safety. And don't forget, on the end goal, we want to have working software in the hands of users. You can find the values of extreme programming and the DORA metrics online and what it means to be low, medium or high performer on the DORA report. Keep in mind that the goal is working software in the hands of end users. And that's it. I hope you can use these. I hope you like them. I'd like to hear from you in the comments. Have you run similar retrospectives yourself, or are you in the boring start, stop, continue loop? Let me know in the comments and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.